In the wake of President Donald Trump's re-election in November 2024, Canada has undergone a marked shift in its economic and diplomatic posture toward the United States. The reintroduction of aggressive U.S. trade policies, most notably a 25% tariff on a broad range of Canadian imports, along with a 10% tariff on energy exports, has sparked concern across Canada's political and business communities. The strain was compounded by Trump's controversial rhetoric suggesting Canada could one day become the 51st state, a statement widely seen as inflammatory and disrespectful of Canadian sovereignty. Since then, Canada has expanded its exports to countries beyond the United States, but one sector that remains deeply tied to the U.S. market is crude oil. However, Canada has now begun to diversify its oil exports away from the U.S., according to Canadian government meeting on June 2nd. Before diving into this emerging development, let's first explore how oil trade between Canada and the United States typically works. As of early June 2025, Western Canadian Select, Canada's benchmark heavy crude, is trading at approximately $52.24 per barrel, while West Texas Intermediate is around $60.79 per barrel. This results in a price differential of about $8.55 per barrel. This price differential arises due to factors such as the heavier quality of WCS and transportation constraints. The United States capitalizes on this discount by importing Canadian oil at lower prices and in some cases re-exporting it at market rates. This practice has been estimated to yield the U.S. an annual windfall of approximately $19 billion. Canada's oil export infrastructure is heavily oriented towards the U.S. market. Canada's oil exports to the United States averaging 4.3 million barrels per day by mid-2024, accounting for roughly 60% of all U.S. crude imports and up from 3.8 million barrels per day in 2023, primarily shipped via pipeline networks such as Enbridge's Mainline and the Trans Mountain System. In 2023, 97% of Canada's crude oil exports, around 3.8 million barrels per day, were delivered to U.S. refineries, valued at approximately $130 billion. Efforts to diversify export destinations have faced numerous obstacles. Projects like the Energy East and Northern Gateway pipelines, which aim to provide access to eastern and western tidewater ports respectively, were cancelled due to regulatory challenges, environmental concerns, and opposition from indigenous communities. The recent completion of the Trans Mountain expansion project in May 2024 has increased capacity to Canada's Pacific coast, allowing for greater access to Asian markets. The TMX tripled the pipeline's capacity from 300,000 to 890,000 barrels per day. However, the TMX's capacity is limited, and further expansion faces similar hurdles that plagued previous projects. In addition to oil, Canada primarily exports its natural gas to the United States. Natural gas sent by pipeline from Canada averaged 5.2 billion cubic feet per day to the U.S. in 2023, 100% of Canada's natural gas exports, rising to 5.4 billion cubic feet per day in the first half of 2024, largely flowing into the western and mid-continent regions. Liquefied natural gas, or LNG, exports from Canada to the United States are still in their early stages. Tilbury LNG has exported small volumes, about 0.04 of a billion cubic feet per day. Meanwhile, LNG Canada began its cool-down in March 2025 and plans to ship its first cargo by mid-2025 with a capacity of 14 million tons per annum. This will gradually reduce pipeline natural gas volumes to the United States once operational. Natural gas from Alberta is delivered to British Columbia and then south via the BC-Washington Interconnect, which has a capacity of approximately 1.9 billion cubic feet per day into the Pacific Northwest. Canada is now actively promoting new pipeline projects and infrastructure development to enable oil and gas exports to markets beyond the United States. Let's turn to the recent announcement made by the Canadian government. On June 2nd, Prime Minister Mark Carney convened a meeting in Saskatoon with the premiers of Canada's 10 provinces. The central goal was to explore ways to accelerate the approval process for major infrastructure and resource projects, particularly in the energy and mining sectors, in order to reduce Canada's heavy reliance on the United States as an export market. Carney opened by emphasizing that, under current norms, obtaining federal approval for large-scale mining or energy developments could take up to a decade. He proposed a framework that would cut that timeline to no more than 2 years by designating select projects as being of national interest. He said in his closing remarks, reiterating his belief that clearer, faster decision-making would stimulate GDP growth and help Canada Trump-proof its economy amid potential U.S. trade pressures. When asked to name potential candidates for fast-tracking, Carney cited several initiatives across the country: Grays Bay Road and Port in Nunavut, a proposed corridor that would connect southern Canada to the Arctic Ocean, opening routes for mineral exports. The Ring of Fire in Ontario, a vast chromite and nickel mining district in northern Ontario, whose development has been stalled by regulatory hurdles and infrastructure gaps. The Pathways Alliance in Alberta, a consortium of oil sands producers planning a $20 billion carbon capture and storage network to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from bitumen extraction, and new pipelines to Tidewater, reiterating support for an oil pipeline to get to Tidewater, acknowledging that at present Canada has only one such conduit, the Trans Mountain, which carries up to 900,000 barrels per day to the Pacific. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, whose province produces roughly 70% of Canada's oil, presented what she termed a grand bargain. Ideally, a privately financed line carrying 1 million barrels of crude per day to northwestern British Columbia, which she estimated could generate $20 billion in annual revenues. In exchange, Alberta's oil sands companies would commit $10 to $20 billion toward technologies that either capture or offset carbon dioxide emissions, supporting projects like the Pathways Alliance. "I'm encouraged by the immediate change of tone that we've seen from recent months," Smith said after the meeting. "When we hear the Prime Minister talking about being an energy superpower, we haven't heard that language for some time." Carney responded positively to Smith's outline. "I agree with her," he said in reference to the grand bargain, while stressing the importance of ensuring any new pipeline transported decarbonized barrels of oil within the broader context of national interest. Ontario Premier Doug Ford characterized the meeting as the best in a decade, applauding Carney's push for national-scale projects. However, he acknowledged that no definitive commitments had been made. "Nothing was carved in stone at this meeting," Ford quipped, likening Carney's departing briefcase of proposals to a Santa Claus sled loaded with items for review over the summer. BC Deputy Premier Nikki Sharma reiterated her province's long-standing opposition to any new bitumen pipeline through British Columbia, noting that there is no proponent currently for such a project, and emphasizing that the government's focus should remain on shovel-ready initiatives. "We have differences of opinion with Alberta on whether a new pipeline is needed," she said, underlining that BC's priorities include renewable energy transmission and critical minerals infrastructure. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew suggested that, over time, a route to Hudson Bay might become the most tenable course toward hitting international tidewaters, despite the fact that the port at Churchill is icebound for much of the year. He emphasized that such a corridor would require significant private sector investment and problem-solving and creativity to become viable. The premiers of New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island underscored the need for improved natural gas and electricity interconnectors with the rest of Canada, stressing that reducing internal trade barriers would help stabilize energy prices in the Maritimes. Before we delve into the details of this news item, may we ask just one thing? Click the like button. It signals to the algorithm that this conversation matters. And leave a comment to sustain the debate, whether you agree, disagree, or have another view entirely. If you have not yet done so, please subscribe and activate notifications to stay updated. Thanks for being part of this. Now let's keep going. Several Indigenous leaders and advocacy groups warned that fast-tracking approvals could undermine their right to meaningful consultation, potentially leading to legal challenges. An Assembly of First Nations spokesperson emphasized, "Any attempt to curtail our input on projects that traverse our traditional territories will be met with resistance." Carney acknowledged these concerns, noting that respecting Indigenous rights is non-negotiable, and pledged that any national interest designation would still require robust consultation processes. Environmental organizations were similarly cautious. A representative from Environmental Defence Canada stated, we cannot abandon our climate targets in the process. While reducing Canada's dependence on the U.S. market is understandable, the representative urged Carney to tie approvals explicitly to verifiable emissions reductions. Carney responded by pointing to the Pathways Alliance as a model, saying, "We need to decarbonize oil production so that any new exports are aligned with Canada's climate commitments." Beyond resource corridors, premiers discussed breaking down interprovincial trade barriers. Carney stated, "Scrapping internal trade obstacles is as important as opening new external markets," arguing that streamlined trade among provinces could spur economic diversification and job creation.